Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I'll just go through our regular Ukraine update for day 233. Vladimir Putin said on Friday that he believed the partial mobilization of army reservists ordered last month would be completed in 2 weeks. A total of 33,000 of them were said to be already in military units, and 16,000 are involved in the military operation in Ukraine. Putin also said that any direct clash of NATO troops with Russia would lead to a global catastrophe. Russia announced it will evacuate residents from Kherson after an appeal from the Russian-installed head of the region. A Ukrainian member of Kherson's regional council has condemned Russia's evacuation of the occupied city, saying it is in fact a deportation. The Ukrainian army boasted of territorial gains near the city of Kherson on Wednesday as NATO allies, including the UK, delivered new air defence systems in the wake of Russia's recent missile attacks across the country. The UK Ministry of Defence says that Russia continues to prosecute offensive operations in central Donbass and is very slowly making progress. Ukraine's armed forces have liberated more than 600 settlements from the Russian occupation in the past month, including 75 in the highly strategic Kherson region. The US and Germany are to deliver sophisticated anti-aircraft systems to Kyiv this month to counter attacks by Russian missiles and kamikaze drones, Ukraine's defence minister said. The governor of Kharkiv has said that two 16-year-old boys were among those injured by Russian shelling in the region in the last 24 hours. Ukraine has accused the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, of inaction in upholding the rights of Ukrainian prisoners of war and urged it to undertake a mission to a camp in the Russian-occupied east of the country. The ICRC responded to the criticism by calling for immediate and unimpeded access to all prisoners of war. The US government has said it can impose sanctions on people, countries and companies that provide ammunition to Russia or support its military-industrial complex. Elon Musk appears to have confirmed on Twitter that funding of the SpaceX Starlink satellite internet system in Ukraine is being pulled. The company is asking the US government to step in and foot the bill. The city of Mykolaiv, 60 miles northwest of Kherson city, was pummeled by Russian missiles on Thursday with one strike on a 5-story apartment block, killing a 31-year-old man and an 80-year-old woman. So I'm really pleased to say that tonight we're joined by Richard. And Richard, your second name is, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Richard Thomson.
Richard Thomson, who's SNP MP from Gordon and is down, well, you're not down in Westminster or London at the moment. But anyway, thank you for joining us this evening.
It's a great pleasure, Brian.
That's, yeah, it should be an interesting show tonight, to say so. So here comes the first story, and I'm sure you can guess what that is going to be. Liz Truss has performed a humiliating U-turn over her flagship plan to cut corporation tax, as she grimly insisted she would hang on as Prime Minister despite being forced to sack her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, over the UK government's disastrous mini-budget. At a hastily called and notably brief Downing Street press conference soon after she replaced Kwarteng with Jeremy Hunt, a subdued-looking Truss told reporters that parts of the mini-budget went further and faster than markets were expecting. Commenting on reports Kwasi Kwarteng's being sacked, SNP Minister Deputy Leader Kirsten Oswald MP said, "No attempt to pass the buck can disguise the fact that Liz Truss is up to her neck in this. The move is a second climb down after Truss's massive package of unfunded tax cuts and spending sent the pound tumbling and plunged markets into turmoil. But in a downbeat performance that seems unlikely to reassure her critics in the party, Truss showed no contrition and insisted she could stay on as the Prime Minister. Despite her U-turn on corporation tax, which the markets had been expecting, Liz Truss failed to give the reassurances the public, MPs and investors were looking for. The FTSE 100 index gains have now been lost, and it is only 42 points ahead at 6,891. That's a 0.6 gain, and the pound dropped 1.2% to $11.91. Sorry, it's alternative, so it's $1.1191. The UK government bonds were rallying before the press conference, pushing yields sharply lower, but the yield on the 30-year gilt has since ticked up 5 basis points to 4.6, and the 10-year yield has risen to 4.2%, which means government borrowing costs will rise. SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford MP said that Liz Truss has no credibility left, and it was only a matter of time before she is removed from office. Mr Blackford said the disastrous policies in the Tory budgets were hers. She trashed the UK economy, and she's to blame for the damage done to people's mortgages, pensions and incomes. The UK is now on the verge of its 5th Prime Minister in just 7 years, and the UK economy is in yet another crisis of the Tories' making. It's never been clearer that Scotland needs independence to escape the constant crisis of Westminster control, Blackford said. So, Richard, although you're not in Westminster, I'm sure you've heard from some of your colleagues in Westminster. So I was going to ask you, can you spill the beans? And is there any way that you can give us some insight into what it's like in Westminster at the moment?
Well, I think most of us got back up the road either on Wednesday or Thursday. I flew up late last night, so I've spent the day in my constituency in Aberdeen. And I was actually out going round Asda today, this afternoon, when most of this was happening. So I've been just picking up some of the threads. But I have to admit, I did have a little chuckle to myself when I saw on the big pile of unsold copies of the Daily Telegraph in Asda, a picture of Kwasi Kwarteng on the front page saying, "I'm not insisting that he wasn't going anywhere." And of course, by that time, he had indeed gone somewhere else, and meaning that the economic historian of a chancellor was himself now economic history. But I think it's fair to say in the last week, the mood has been alternating between despairing, if you're a Conservative, and mutinous. On Wednesday, Prime Minister's Questions, Liz Truss arrived in the chamber and was greeted with an almighty cheer. Normally that would have lifted her spirits, but the cheer actually came from Labour and the SNP. Then she made a complete hash of Prime Minister's Questions and left her MPs in utter despair that, she was saying, trying to respond to a question, was saying, "Mr. Speaker, I am unclear." And of course, everybody reacted as you'd expect. And then she went and repeated it and did it again. And that's the trouble. People think that she is unclear. And so her troops are in mutiny. A little vignette I can offer myself. I speak for the SNP on Northern Irish matters in the House of Commons, and there was the language and culture and identity bill was getting its second reading on Wednesday afternoon. And the former Secretary of State, Julian Lewis, the MP for Skipton and Ripon, a Conservative, contributed. And towards the end of this bill on language and culture, he said that they'd grown up in Scotland, and in Scotland there's a wonderful word, scunnered, and that he said that he felt that adequately described the feeling in the government benches that day. So you've got to remember, most of the MPs that the Tories have did not vote for Liz Truss. An awful lot of the support that was pledged to her was pledged in anticipation, in the hope that those making the pledges of their support might end up with jobs. But they've taken 3 weeks to basically blow it. And if it hadn't been for the events around the death of the Queen, it would have happened even earlier than that. And I think the real villains of the piece in this are those who thought that they could label everybody else as part of an anti-growth coalition, and at the same time, they've been sitting on the sidelines for years, thinking that they and only they had the solutions to get Britain moving, through Brexit and through these ridiculous unfunded tax cuts, and of course they've been shown to be found wanting within a matter of days, in effect, because she's only been in the Prime Minister for 7 parliamentary days out of all the time since she was appointed. And I think that it just goes to show what happens when you allow a bunch of dangerous ideologues to go around causing mayhem by supergluing themselves to the policy prescriptions of think tanks like the Institute for Economic Affairs. So I think it really is time for a clear out of that ideology. It really is time for a clear out of those who have promoted that ideology. And I don't think the Conservatives necessarily have the capacity to do that, except on a minimal scale. And it just feels like one of those kind of end of government moments that the best solution would be a general election to sweep it all away and start again. But I think that whenever the election is, the Tories are in for an absolute hammering, and deservedly so.
Yes, and it truly is incredible. And if anything, this truly must be the UK in crisis. I mean, after today's events, we've now had 4 chancellors in 1 year, and it's only October. And those 4 chancellors.
We're going through prime ministers almost as quickly as Aberdeen Football Club go through managers. And I can just say thank goodness we all voted no in 2014 to Scottish independence, so that we avoided all this kind of crisis in the markets. And I'm being sarcastic, incidentally, for anyone that wants to clip that and use it maliciously. But it just goes to show that where was the stability that we were promised? Where's the continued membership of the European Union that was promised? We've got a government that is unpicking any form of social value. They're not building for the long term. They're certainly not building in growth that's sustainable. They're not getting to grips with the main environmental challenges. Now really is surely the time for people to give independence proper consideration, even if they were against it before, because I don't want to make the negative argument that surely we can't do worse than this, but really it is time that we were in control of our economy and all our political decisions, and that we were able to use our very considerable resources to our own benefit and be completely, if England is going to continue voting for a bunch of charlatans like this, that we remove ourselves as deftly as we can from the resulting carnage that's going to unfold.
So Richard, you made the point that if there is a general election, then the Tories are going to get hammered, you said. But so how do they make the decision whether is a general election the answer? And if it is, how do they decide what to do, whether they just keep going on or whether they take the jump and go for a general election to get a change?
I honestly can't see them going for a general election. I mean, they have a majority notionally of 80, albeit I don't think that Liz Truss has that majority in real terms. I'm not sure who can bring that about, but I think a lot of them will be looking at their next career move. They'll be looking at, they can ride it out for another couple of years. I think the most likely date for a general election is still May 2024. I really can't see them pushing the self-destruct button at this point in time. They'll be hoping that something turns up, but I think that there will be some form of internal Tory party coalition is put together, and that will see them to the next election, and then it'll be left to somebody whoever survives that to pick up the pieces afterwards. But although I think a general election would be the best thing to progress on a number of issues at this point in time, I don't think that it's necessarily going to happen. I think that I think they will soldier on, but they're a bit like John Major's government now after Black Wednesday. It's done, and everybody can see what's going to happen. The question is how we can get the best interests of the people of Scotland to the fore in that arrangement. And lest anyone be in any doubt, the problems of Westminster rule over Scotland don't disappear simply because a Labour government might be in the offing.
Okay, so they're too fair to have a general election, but and Truss has been in front of the 1922 committee already, which seems like apparently didn't go very well for her. So if they do make some kind of change at the top and oust her and replace her with someone else, that'll be 3 prime ministers on the back of one general election, the one that Boris Johnson won. Is that right? Or no, the one that anyway. But surely that can't be allowed.
Well, it is. Welcome to the unwritten British Constitution. You can change Prime Ministers. We don't directly elect Prime Ministers. The Prime Minister is the person who can command a majority in the House of Commons. And right now, unless the Conservatives are really going to melt down, that's always going to be somebody from the Conservatives. And if just as Boris Johnson's position eroded because he could no longer command the confidence of enough people to form a government, if the same becomes true of Liz Truss, with or without the massive resignations that we saw in the final days of Johnson's government, then yes, under the current constitutional setup, they're perfectly able. In fact, the Constitution expects them to put somebody forward as a candidate to be Prime Minister, and no election is required. But I think people are increasingly scunnered, to use that word, with this government, and one way or another, they're going to be out the door, and they're going to be at the end of an electoral hiding. But as I say, just because a different government takes over, it doesn't dissolve the problems that we have of Westminster governments in general, and people taking decisions for us and having things done to us, rather than us being fully in charge of our own affairs through a parliament with all the powers of an independent country.
Thanks, Richard. But quickly, just before we move on, it's not that long since the Scottish Government was urged to adopt the same budget as the mini budget that Kwarteng put forward, or the same package. So we pretty much dodged a bullet there, did we?
Absolutely, and it wasn't so long ago Douglas Ross was appearing on Border television, interviewed by Peter McMahon and the Representing Border programme, and he was endorsing wholeheartedly the tax cuts, including the cut to the 45 pence top rate of tax. That was just immediately after the then Chancellor's mini budget. Of course, the next day, Douglas Ross was then saying he was worried about his mortgage. Gee, Douglas, I wonder why. And then, he was endorsing the U-turn just a matter of a few days later. So I think increasingly we see the truth. And what Jacob Rees-Mogg once said of Mr. Ross, that he is indeed a bit of a lightweight. His only political purpose seems to be to spout the gospel of SNP bad at every turn, and to endorse as wholeheartedly as he can whatever position his masters in London adopt. And it's no secret that many of his own MSPs are questioning his judgment and his ability to do his job as leader of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Accounting Unit up here. And I think that for all that the attention is focused on the psychodrama around about Liz Truss and what the Tory party has inflicted across the UK has inflicted on the UK, I don't think it will be too long before the focus of attention starts to shift to the vacuum of leadership at the heart of the Scottish Tories.
Thank you, Richard. So let's move on. Bankers' bonuses have doubled since the 2008 financial crash, according to research by the TUC, which accuses the government of enriching city financiers while holding down the pay of key workers. The union's umbrella body said bonuses in finance and the insurance sector have reached a record £20,000 a year on average, which it says is almost 1.5 times the average pay collected by teaching assistants. The TUC found that average city bonuses increased by 101% in cash terms between 2008 and 2022, prior to the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng's, announcing plans last month to scrap the bankers' bonus cap. Francis O'Grady, General Secretary of the TUC, said, "Everyone who works for a living deserves to earn a decent living, but ministers are holding down the pay of millions of key workers while lining the pockets of city financiers," adding, "There is simply no justification for lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, especially when nurses and teaching assistants are having to use food banks to get by. There are 3,519 bankers working in the UK, making more than €1 million, that's £880,000 a year, according to the European Banking Authority. That is more than 7 times as many as in Germany, which has the second highest number of €1 million a year bankers." The latest EBA figures show the 27 bankers were, show 27, sorry, I'll repeat that. The latest EBA figures show 27 UK bankers were paid more than 10 million euros in 2019, while 2 UK-based asset managers received between 30 million euros and 39 million euros. And one merchant banker was paid 64.8 million euros. The merchant banker received a fixed salary of 242,000 euros, topped up with a bonus of 64.6 million euros. Sharon Graham, General Secretary of the Unite Union, said some companies in banking and insurance have been profiteering on the back of inflation after already making massive profits year on year. Now this government has removed the cap on mega bonuses for bankers that was meant to help prevent us having to pay for another crash like 2008. So Richard, does this prove that the Tory party, as led by Truss, is driven by ideology rather than what's best for ordinary people? Surely this shows that they didn't need to remove the bankers' bonus cap as they planned to.
Well, I think people were just open-mouthed and agape in shock that in terms of how lousy the politics of it was when Kwasi Kwarteng doubled down in his mini-budget statement on the widely trailed pledge to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. And, I'm sure our hearts bleed for all the bankers who were having to get by and the miserable prospect of only being able to get bonuses that were double their existing generous salaries. It's interesting that there was such a backlash in the city to proposals round about this. These are people who are very well paid and do important jobs, but even they could see that this was a budget which gave so little to those who needed it most and gave so much to those who needed it least, was not just economically unsustainable but politically unsustainable. And it's a thorough repudiation of the trickle-down economics theory, because whatever it is that trickles down, it's certainly not wealth in any great volumes. So I think there's been a welcome repudiation of that across the board. But bankers and those in the City of London were already being very well paid. But I think that in terms of tackling many of the crises that are being faced, the pressures that were being faced, particularly after the pandemic, we had a public sector which is much maligned by the kind of think tanks that have been proposing the sorts of tax-cutting measures that have ended so disastrously for the government. And what we really need to be doing is making sure that those vital public jobs are secure and are well paid. That, for example, there was a repeal this week, and something which I welcomed, of the health and social care levy, of the increase in national insurance. Now, my argument at the time was that this was not a progressive increase in taxation. It hit the poorest or the lowest earners disproportionately, and that it would have been far better for the government to look at other taxes, like pushing up income taxes in a progressive way, even increasing that top rate of tax that they were trying to get rid of, or by looking at things like capital gains tax and other wealth taxes, so the totality of wealth across these islands was properly taken account of in terms of deciding how the burden financially of such measures could best be shared. But we've got, if there's problems in our care sector, it's largely because we haven't done enough. Not in England, they haven't done anything like that made the progress that we have in Scotland in terms of integrating health and social care. There are no plans for a national care service as there is in Scotland to be delivered by the end of the current Scottish parliamentary term. But even in Scotland, we're not doing, I don't think, enough yet to ensure that careers in care are as rewarding financially as they need to be. And because what we need to do is to be able to attract people into the care sector and then to retain them. And that's a job that's been made very much harder in terms of staffing our care services since Brexit, and since so many of the people who came to our country to work have voted with their feet. So I think the UK government was looking at this from the wrong end of end of the telescope and had their priorities completely wrong. But to get back to it, I think there is an irony that the self-appointed, self-described free marketeers of the Conservative Party have had a pretty sharp lesson in what free markets actually think about plans and policies that are unsustainable, and that's what we've seen come to roost and home to roost in the most spectacular fashion over the past week or so.
Thanks, Richard. We'd better move on, but thank you for that. Royal Mail said it may need to cut up to 10,000 jobs by next August, blaming strike action by its workers and the continuing decline of its core business. In an unscheduled trading update a day after Royal Mail workers staged a 24-hour strike over pay and conditions, its parent company, International Distribution Services, said thousands of roles would have to go at Royal Mail because of damage and disruption caused by industrial action, as well as declining parcel volumes. Royal Mail said it expects to make an annual operating loss of about £350 million in the year to the end of March 2023. It said that could rise to £450 million if customers turn to rivals because of the disruptions to its delivery services. The company said that it was looking at making redundant up to 6,000 full-time frontline jobs in delivery and processing by the end of August next year. Overall, Royal Mail said it is seeking an overall reduction of 10,000 full-time equivalent, that's FTE roles, over the same period, and said more might have to go if new strike dates are announced. This includes cutting overtime, temporary staff roles, and not filling roles when employees leave the business. In total, Royal Mail employs about 140,000 people. Responding to job cuts, the CWU called for an urgent meeting with management and accused Royal Mail of holding postal workers to ransom and turning the economy into a gig economy-style parcel courier. So, Richard, I'm thinking that Royal Mail must be one of the biggest employers in the country, and this story seems to align with the upcoming postal ballot for NHS Scotland staff who are being balloted on industrial action at the moment. The Royal Mail strike risks affecting the NHS postal ballots arriving on time. But do you think, a posit a theory, could the Royal Mail be nationalised in Scotland as we have with water and the railways? And if not, why not?
I think Royal Mail would be better off nationalised, frankly. It was, let's not forget that it was a International Distribution Services, IDS. It's a set of initials that seems to bring nothing but grief to the Conservative Party at various points. But that is a private company that emerged out of the post office, as we all know, and the General Post Office and Royal Mail, as we all know it. So I think it would be much, much better if instead of trying to run it as a private business, I mean, you can run publicly owned businesses in a very business-like fashion. You can make a surplus. Royal Mail, as far as I recall, always did. But it was privatised under the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition. So while I've got the tackety boots on tonight for the failings of the Conservatives, let's not leave the Liberal Democrats out of it, because it was Vince Cable, as the business secretary, who was responsible for overseeing the privatisation of this. And what that privatisation and competition means is that the lucrative parts, you end up scrapping over that, but there's still that public service obligation on the company that's left over to fulfil the general mail service. And without the profitable bits, you lose the ability to, or where there's competition in the profitable bits, it's inevitable that the costs of providing a universal service aren't being met in quite the same way, and it leads to these kinds of losses. I am willing to be corrected, but I don't think that the Scottish Government would be able to nationalise bits of it, simply because there is no distinct Scottish entity within the Royal Mail. Within the Royal Mail organisation. I'm not sure, it's been a while since I've read through the Scotland Act to see what's regulated in terms of mail services and any regulation that goes on round about that. But without there being a distinctly Scottish element to it, it's hard to see what you would actually be seeking to nationalise and how lawful that would be. So while I would very much like to see the UK government nationalising it, and in the context of an independent Scotland, I think the arguments for, in order to maintain a universal service, it would be much easier to do if it were government owned, with the proper investment and treating it as that public service and treating the workforce in it with respect as part of a public service that's integral to the well-being of the nation. I don't see that it's something that we're able to do under devolution, although I'd be happy to be corrected in that.
Thank you, Richard. So moving on, Drugs Policy Minister Angela Constance has written to UK Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire, Jeremy Quinn, to outline a number of concerns about proposed new consequences for drug possession in the Home Office publication Swift, Certain, Tough. The Swift, Certain, Tough paper sets out that some proposals, including the most punitive, may apply in Scotland. The UK government claims that these measures are a step towards changing the damaging culture of drug use. However, Ms Constance disagrees, pointing out that these measures are contradictory to the human rights-based public health approach that the Scottish Government is implementing, and could undermine aspects of the Scottish national mission to improve and save lives. The Drugs Policy Minister has previously outlined that these proposals, in particular the confiscation of passports or driver's licences, raise significant concerns on civil liberties and human rights grounds, and she is concerned about the lack of evidence to support the effectiveness of such measures. The Swift, Certain, Tough proposals appear to have been designed with the criminal justice system in England and Wales in mind, without detailed consideration of how this would work in Scotland. It is not clear how these policies will be implemented, but while the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 may be reserved, its implementation as part of the justice system is devolved. So, Richard, for me, this chimes with how the Scottish Government is changing, as said in the story, how the Scottish Government is changing the way benefits for people, say, for example, with disabilities, are dealt with in a humane way. Well, while Westminster maintains a punitive system, this Home Office publication is another example of Scotland's two governments being at odds with one another. Have you any idea how this will end?
No, in summary, I mean, the Scottish Government has set out its proposals for tackling the many different drugs problems that there are, but the one thing that there appears to be a consensus across all thinking elements of Scottish public life is that the criminal approach to individual usage is counterproductive, frankly, that we're better off treating it as a public, by all means tackling the dealers and those who exploit. But when it comes to individual users, taking the public health approach. And I think that even just the title of this document, Swift, Certain, Tough, it'll inevitably be none of these things, but it's just a piece of crowd-pleasing red meat for those who want simple solutions to complex problems. I mean, if you're talking about confiscating people's passports or driving licenses, you're making it much, much harder for people who want to move away from lives where they involve drugs. You're making it much, much harder for them to earn a living or to support families or to move out of the kind of social circles that they would be mixing in, where there are often friendship groups which are devoted solely to or primarily to the consumption of drugs, whether they're for a recreational purpose or more widely. So, I think this is completely ill-conceived. It's the wrong direction entirely. And again, it just shows that whenever a UK politician wants to get on their high horse about the drugs problem that we know exists in Scotland, that when they say that the Scottish Government already has the powers to tackle that, they're not being completely candid. They're not telling the truth about that. There is this other legislative punitive aspect to it, and also in terms of the classification of drugs and the penalties that flow from that. And I think it would be much, much better if we were able to be separated from that competing agenda that people seem to be happy to vote for at times in England. I don't think the Labour Party would be, as a Labour Party, frightened of its own shadow, it seems to be at times. I don't see them taking a radically different approach, because even in their current condition, they would be terrified of doing anything that might allow the Daily Mail to say right nasty things about them. So they're very, very conservative in their own way and risk averse. So I think that you're devolving the misuse of drugs acts so that we're in control not just of the public policy, but we're also in control of the legal consequences of drug possession. That makes it much, much easier to get that coherent whole systems approach that would benefit those who find themselves in that cycle of drug use to the detriment of their health, their families, and the well-being of communities. And it starts by marrying up not just the resource, but the policy in all its aspects. And that's why the Scotland would be better for all concerned if all aspects of not just law enforcement, but also law writing on this matter were within the auspices of the Scottish jurisdiction.
Thank you, Richard. We'd better move on. UK government ministers are being taken to court by a body chaired by the former leader of the Conservatives in the EU Parliament over allegations the government is breaking the law on EU citizens' rights post-Brexit. The Independent Monitoring Authority claims 2.6 million EU citizens are at automatic risk of losing their right to live, work and retire in the UK and may face deportation because of an alleged unlawful interpretation of the withdrawal agreement by the Home Office rules. The High Court has already granted the Independent Monitoring Authority, a statutory body set up post-Brexit to protect EU citizens' rights, a judicial review of the Home Office rules, scheduled to be heard on November 1st. In a skeleton argument lodged in the High Court on Thursday, the Independent Monitoring Authority said the Home Office had set conditions for residency rights that it claims are unlawful. At the heart of the case is a settlement scheme created by the government to ensure the rights of EU citizens from European Economic Area countries who had an automatic right to live in the UK pre-Brexit under free movement rules. About 5.8 million EU citizens were granted status to remain settled in the UK, but 2.6 million were granted pre-settled status because they had been in the country for fewer than 5 years. Under Home Office rules, they are obliged to reapply for indefinite right to remain in the country, known as settled status, once their pre-settled status expires. If they do not, they risk losing the right to be in the UK. The IMA contends in its High Court argument that the withdrawal agreement does not provide for loss of status in such circumstances. It contains that under the law, EU citizens' rights do not expire unless they are lost or withdrawn for reasons laid out in Article 15(3) of the withdrawal agreement, which makes clear that once acquired, the right of permanent residence shall be lost only through absence from the host state for a period exceeding 5 consecutive years. The Independent Monitoring Authority continues, the right of residence is not limited in time and in particular does not expire after 5 years, save in the case of extended absence from the UK. The Internal Monitoring Authority is concerned that the Home Office rule could have devastating consequences for most vulnerable EU citizens, including those with chaotic lives, the elderly and children in care, who may not know they have to reapply for settled status. The Home Office said it did not agree with the Independent Monitoring Authority's interpretation of the withdrawal agreement, and its position remained that people should reapply for settled status before their pre-settled status expires. So, Richard, this story for me shows that Brexit isn't done yet, and it takes me back to, I think it was a couple of years ago that Guy Verhofstadt in the EU Parliament said that this is about the automatic recognition of rights of EU citizens in the UK. The EU want rights to be automatically recognised, he said, with no need for any bureaucracy. The UK disagrees and wants bureaucracy. How how do you think this will end?
Badly. Would you like me to expand on that?
Well, you don't have to expand too much because we are short of time, but please do, yes.
Yeah, I mean, Guy Verhofstadt is right. I mean, we've been we did have as part of the four freedoms when we were in the single market, we had the free movement of people. And it seems, you know, a big part of the drive in certain parts of the Tory right to leave the European Union was simply that they didn't like the number of non-British people who were here and working. So, you know, I can't for the life. I mean, we've seen the economic harm that that's caused in many of the sectors where people were working. We see it in the northeast of Scotland, where we've lost a significant amount of labour, particularly in our agricultural sector, and it sent out such a horrendous message that people were not welcome here, and that was why it was so important that the Scottish government put out the messaging that it did about how people were welcome and we wanted them to stay, because it was in stark contrast to the message that was being pumped out on a daily basis by the UK government and the tabloid newspapers that enabled them. But it'll be interesting to see how this court case ends. But I can't for the life of me understand why any sane, sensible government would want to make it harder for people who are here, who have chosen to make their lives here, would want to make it harder for them to actually do that. The only reason can possibly be that they're set on just going back to their fantasies of how things were in the 1950s, and they're getting some kind of oldie worldy version of Britain that never existed back. But they're doing untold economic harm through this, and they're doing untold damage to our collective reputation. And this is just the latest iteration of this lunacy.
Thank you, Richard. A heavily pregnant rape survivor from Eritrea has been threatened with forced removal to Rwanda by the Home Office. Human rights campaigners say it is the most egregious case they have come across so far in the government scheme to outsource the processing of UK asylum claims to the East African country. Linked cases are currently going through the courts, challenging the lawfulness of forcibly removing asylum seekers who arrived recently in the UK in small boats and claimed asylum to Rwanda. The 28-year-old woman, who is 37 weeks pregnant, is in a state of acute distress about the threatened removal. Doctors say scans show her baby has stopped growing and she may need to be induced. Home Office officials were aware that she was pregnant when she arrived in the UK on a small boat in July and organised a pregnancy scan for her. Officials have also moved her from one hotel to another after she became unwell with pregnancy-related nausea in the first hotel. The woman, who is using the pseudonym Delina, said she was really frightened about what might happen to her and her baby. She had been living in an informal refugee camp in Calais for 8 months before travelling to the UK in a dinghy, and was struggling to survive there as a homeless young woman, even before the rape occurred. She has spent decades in search of safety. She fled Eritrea at the age of 3 with her mother, and her father was killed by the government. Her mother first took her to the Sudan and then to Lebanon. She has no family members left. I have not been able to sleep since I got the Rwanda notice, she said. A recent report from the charity Medical Justice, which analysed the cases of 36 people threatened with removal to Rwanda, found that 26 showed evidence of torture, 15 showed evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder, and 11 had suicidal thoughts. In a separate case, a female trafficking victim was also threatened with removal to Rwanda. So, Richard, for me, this is shades of the Theresa May's hostile environment, but also it sounds like the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman's dream is a bit closer to becoming a reality. Would the First Minister agree that this is detestable?
I think she almost certainly would, and I certainly agree that this is something that is thoroughly detestable in terms of the impact of this policy. I mean, the poor woman's story that you've just narrated there is utterly harrowing, and I think that for the UK has always given itself this kind of special status, that every country believes it's exceptional to some extent, but there just seems to be this particular exceptionalism about the UK and about its moral force that it has in the world. And you see that being burnished on a daily basis with when politicians talk about the support that we're giving to Ukraine, and that's absolutely the right thing to be doing. But it's really a black mark against our collective reputation to see people like Suella Braverman saying so airily that it's her dream to see planes taking off to Rwanda, because behind each deportation flight that the UK government now is going to do now, it's got itself into the people trafficking business. Behind each of these deportation flights will be tens of, not hundreds of individual stories, every bit as harrowing in their own way as the one that you've just spoken of. And nobody comes here, nobody is illegal, nobody comes here illegally, and we have an obligation to the rest of the world to make sure that we process people fairly and that we allow them a place of safety if that's what our obligations dictate that we should do. That's not something that should be up for debate, and I think it shows just how diminished the UK has become in our debate, that we have a Conservative government that is doing this, but let's not forget it was also a Labour Party that sold merchandise through its Labour Party shop that had mugs which said tougher controls on immigration. We need to stop pandering to the basest, lowest common denominator elements. We need to stop with this, and we need to start making the argument, the humane argument, the rational argument about why immigration is good and why we have obligations internationally to allow people to come here as a place of safety. Because, quite frankly, when you look at the major conflicts around the world and the examples of displacement, there are many other countries less able than the UK to absorb that those people, those who are being displaced, than the UK, who take far more proportionately and numerically than the UK does. So the idea that the UK is somehow this uniquely put upon place which is only being held back from its true potential by excessively high taxes or by those horrible Europeans not allowing us to fulfil our destiny is just utter cobblers. And one of the hopes I have out of the events of the past week is that we might be on a route to bringing that into perspective. In my maiden speech in the Commons, I quoted the former Danish finance minister, Christian Jensen, who said that there were only two kinds of European countries. There were those that are small countries, and there were those that have yet to realise that they are, in fact, small countries. And I think there is a day of reckoning coming where the UK will have to face up to the fact that it isn't exceptional, it isn't special, and it is, in fact, a small country. The thing is that small countries can have big minds, big hearts, big imaginations, and I think the contrast between how we would like an independent Scotland to be with the reality of how the UK is something that will be pretty compelling when we put our case to the Scottish people on that.
Truly is heartbreaking. Thank you, Richard. A congressional panel has voted to compel Donald Trump to testify under oath after naming the former president as the central cause of the deadly attack on the US Capitol on January 6. The House of Representatives Select Committee investigating last year's riot voted unanimously on Thursday to subpoena Trump for testimony and documents in what may prove a mostly symbolic gesture, given the time constraints and his likely legal resistance. We have no doubt, none, that Donald Trump led an effort to upend American democracy, and that directly resulted in the violence of January 6, said Benny Thomson, chair of the committee, watched by police officers who defended the Capitol on that day. He tried to take away the voice of the American people in choosing their president and replaced the will of the voters with his will to remain in power. He is the one person at the centre of the story of what happened on January 6, so we want to hear from him. He said, although some members of Trump's inner circle, including his daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner, have testified to the committee, the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and 4 fellow Republicans have ignored subpoenas. The panel is set to dissolve soon after next month's midterm elections if Republicans gain control of the House. Trump responded to the subpoena via his Truth social platform, but did not say whether he would comply. The Select Committee has been investigating the attack on the Capitol for more than a year, interviewing more than 1,000 witnesses. It surpassed many observers' expectations over the summer with a series of hearings that, polls suggest, convinced some Republicans that Trump bears some responsibility for the riot. On Thursday, at its ninth and possibly final hearing, the panel sought to reclaim the spotlight less than a month before congressional midterm elections, in which thousands of Republicans who back Trump's false claim of election fraud are running for office. It presented devastating witness testimony that put Trump at the heart of a premeditated coup attempt and violent assault on American democracy. Unlike past hearings, there was no live witness testimony, but one by one committee members presented video evidence from witnesses, some of whom had not been seen at its earlier hearings, and information from nearly 1 million emails, documents and recordings obtained from the Secret Service. Again, it's a simple question, Richard. What do you think will happen next? Or how do you think this will end?
I honestly have no idea. I mean, it's quite obvious to most observers what happened, that Donald Trump engaged in the most pernicious stirring and seeding of myths around the integrity of the political system to get elected and the electoral process, when it looked like that the system might, that the voters might be about to remove him from office. And he at no point during his unlamented tenure in office was the president that the people of the United States either deserved or needed, albeit you had to respect the people respected his mandate. He seemed disinclined to respect other mandates or other norms of government or any of the checks and balances that were there. And on the day of the Capitol riot, what came home to roost was the seeding, as I say, of those groups who were willing to believe things that were completely untrue about the nature of the United States government. And instead of giving the orders that any president should have done in their constitutional role, the situation was allowed to spiral out of control. And now, of course, there's I think I saw some of the earlier sessions of the Senate committee investigating this, where they were able to reveal footage about what had happened, to reveal timelines about what had happened, which brutally exposed the actions of some politicians and what they had said, and the contrasting faces that they put on this, including one Republican who was seen hot-footing, running away from the protesters himself, and was being rightly laughed at for that behaviour, which was in sharp contrast to the image that he presented of himself throughout that. But we also got to see how Donald Trump, as I say, failed to give the orders to the security services that should have been given in order to make sure that the integrity, not just of the Capitol building, but the integrity of the United States Constitution and the orderly transfer of power was maintained. So I don't know where this goes, but there is that subset in American politics that American politics is very, very partisan and divided at the moment. But there is that group there who will believe nothing ill of Mr. Trump or the forces that would have him back in power. And it is literally the definition of a kind of post-truth politics. All I think the committee can do is carry on doing what it is doing within the constitutional remit that it's been given, and set the truth out there as it needs to, for those who are willing and capable of making an informed judgment to do so. But I think it's pretty clear that America is in a very, very difficult place at the moment, and truth and sunlight are the only disinfectants to that. I think it's going to take a great deal of work before Americans can come together as in ways that we'd always taken for granted that it would, in terms of the ending some of the bitter divisive partisanship that there is in the political system at present.
Thanks, Richard. Time's against us if we're going to be able to fit in the last story, but so maybe just in a yes/no answer, do you think Trump is going to end up in jail?
No.
No? Okay. So moving on to...
He probably should, but I don't think he will.
Yeah, or in court maybe, and that'll be a start. So moving on to our final story of the evening. A new fund for those affected by violence against women and girls has supported nearly 20,000 survivors in its first 6 months. The Delivering Equally Safe Fund provided £9.5 million to 121 projects in its first 3 months. These projects give one-to-one emotional and practical support, as well as refuge, legal or financial advice and other services. Many of the organisations also run training and outreach programmes to prevent violence against women and girls. Equalities Minister Christina McKelvey visited the Source Project in Blantyre, run jointly by the charities Wasler and Liber8, to learn how it supports women in Lanarkshire who have been affected by both substance use and domestic abuse. Ms McKelvey said, "The projects supported through our Delivering Equally Safe Fund offer a lifeline to survivors of violence and abuse. Tackling violence against women and girls is a core priority for the Scottish Government, and this fund is a key element ensuring innovative projects can support survivors and tackle the root causes of violence and abuse. Forgive me. So it's clear this is a Scottish Government initiative, Richard. Is there a comparative scheme coming from Westminster?
I wouldn't want to say no, but I'm not aware of anything like that coming through. But of course, under devolution, this is something that is very much within the scope of the responsibilities of the Scottish Government, and I think it's tremendously encouraging to see this kind of approach coming forward, because violence against women and children, particularly male violence, is something that, despite the campaigns, is still all too prevalent in society, and it can be incredibly difficult for those who are on the receiving end of that violence and abuse to often to see a future away from that, out of that, and so it's important that we're providing places of safety and routes and all the support that we need to, not just to extricate people from that situation if that's what they're in, but also to make sure that there's proper wraparound support for people to move on in their lives away from that abusive environment. So I think that these initiatives are fantastic. It's great to see the Scottish Government funding them, but we need to keep on looking at how we can do more to change the culture that creates and fosters that violence in the first instance.
Thank you, Richard. I don't know if you heard, Richard, but just before we came on air, we learned that Robbie Coltrane had died, the star of Tutti Frutti Cracker and Harry Potter. Did you know that? Or?
Yes, I heard that, and it's tremendously sad news. I mean, we'll all have our own memories of Robbie Coltrane and whatever role he was in. And you mentioned Tutti Frutti there, a tremendous BBC Scotland production. Obviously, he appeared in Blackadder as well. There's a cameo in there. I think he played Dr. Johnston in that particular episode. Cracker, he was tremendous, and of course he brought his talents, came to a whole new generation through the Harry Potter films. So he leaves a tremendous legacy. But what a character he was, and what an actor and a performer and expresser of ideas in that sense through his acting that he was, and literally a larger than life character. And he'll be very, very sadly missed, but hopefully can remain an inspiration to all those who are making their way in the creative arts as what somebody from Scotland can achieve.
Yes, Richard, well, as you said, he will be missed. So that's all that we have for this evening. Richard, thank you for joining us and giving us time out of your busy schedule. Really appreciate it.
Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you. So before I go, I just want to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular contribution, a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff and to make more programmes. So if you could follow the link below to www.broadcastingscotland.scot/donate and sign up, we'd be most grateful. There are other ways to help, and so if you were to visit our social media, Broadcast at Scott, at Broadcast Scot on Twitter or on Facebook, or just on our general website, www.broadcastingscotland.scot, then you'll find information there on how to come and join us. We'd be happy to hear from you. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you again tomorrow night with, on Sunday with the Full Scottish. And again, Richard, thank you, and everyone else, good night.